All right, so what I want to do in this video is just walk you through a real story of a client that I worked with just a few weeks ago. Someone who makes a really decent income, someone who has really done well for themselves, and at the same time, they realize the value of overfunded whole life insurance. And that's really what I want to talk you through within this entire video here. And so I'm going to be reading an article that I put together specifically about this particular person, but then of course I'll be giving my commentary along the way. So without further ado, let's hop into it. What a $400,000 earner realized about financial stability, okay? So recently I sat down with a 47-year-old electrical engineer earning roughly $400,000 per year. And so on paper, he was doing almost everything perfectly, right? He had accumulated over $1.2 million in his 401k. He had additional brokerage assets. He had company purchase plans, strong retirement benefits, and he had years and years of disciplined savings behind him. And like many financially responsible professionals, he had spent decades doing exactly what he was told to do. Work hard, save aggressively, invest consistently, and just really kind of trust the long-term market growth. One of the things that I want to emphasize is that I'm not here to say that that's a bad strategy by any stretch of the imagination, because can it work? The answer is yes. It's just going to be a matter of, as you'll see throughout the rest of this video, it's just going to be a matter of how stable is it when the markets don't necessarily work in your favor, and do you have a backup plan? Do you have something that can coincide along with the stock market based assets? And that's what we're going to be getting at throughout the rest of this video. And so anyways, to be fair, much of that strategy could have worked, like I was saying before, but during our conversations, he slowly began realizing something that was extremely important. Almost all of his financial confidence was tied to either the stock market or his continued employment, okay? Now, to be clear, this wasn't someone who hated investing by any stretch of the imagination, okay? He was not one of those anti-market people, and neither am I. In fact, the market had played a very major, very pivotal role in helping him build the wealth up to this point in time. The issue here was not growth, the issue was concentration within one asset class. And so think about the word diversification. A lot of times when people hear the word the diversification, they're hearing it through the lens of, I have a little bit of Apple stock, I have a little bit of Tesla stock, I have a little bit of Amazon stock, so on and so on and so on. But the problem with that is the simple fact that all of it's tied to the same sort of volatile asset class, and it's something that you have literally next to no control over whatsoever. And so I like to add the word asset class diversification, like asset class diversification, not just diversification, because it assumes that you have different assets that work completely differently than one another, and they're not correlated with one another either, right? And so that's where I think life insurance really fits into the picture, but we'll get into a little bit more of that as we go on. So anyways, for him, the issue was not about growth. It was about concentration, like I said, because once we started walking through his overall financial picture together, it became apparent that nearly every major asset that he owned was correlated in some way, shape, or form. His 401k, his brokerage account, his company stock purchase plan, there's a little bit of nuance there, and even a large portion of his future retirement income and confidence was all based on the stock market and its performance, like literally nothing that he has control over. And so much of it ultimately depended on markets that continued to operate. And emotionally, that started to feel heavier to him than it once had. Part of what triggered the reflection was the environment that's around him. There had been some layoffs within the industry that he works in, along with some kind of just turbulence within the industry overall. He's an engineer. And although he was financially successful, right, he's done extremely well for himself, he earns a significant amount of money, it caused him to kind of take a step back and ask a deeper question. The question that he asked is, what portion of my financial life is actually stable? And what I asked him to kind of contemplate on kind of in between meetings was, how much or even what percentage of your future retirement income do you not want exposed to stock market risk, business risk, and real estate risk? And I think that's a much more important question than most people realize, because many people spend decades focused almost entirely on accumulation. They work to maximize account balances, increase contribution, they pursue growth as much as they can. But eventually, many people begin realizing that accumulation and stability are not one and the same, right? Accumulation, climbing up the mountain, you make it to the mountaintop, you started to retire, and then having some stability to get down the mountain safely, completely different things, completely two different approaches to the way that you're looking at money, okay? And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But you can have high income, you can have substantial assets, you can have a strong net worth, and yet still feel overly exposed. That was the shift that was starting to happen here within my client here. one of the things we discussed extensively was retirement income and the pressures of the volatility of the stock market and the pressures that it can have on your future cash flow. Because retirement is not just about reaching a certain number by any stretch of the imagination. It's all about understanding how reliable and sustainable that number actually is once you begin living on it. Right? There's a lot of other factors that are associated with that, but that's really what it boils down. Like, how reliable and sustainable is my cash flow in retirement? That's what future cash flow planning, as it should be called, but that's what retirement planning is all about, okay? And that's where many people begin seeing the stock market a little bit differently in this sort of scenario. When they're looking at it through the lens of stability, they look at the stock market a lot differently. Not negatively, they're not downplaying it, but just differently, okay? Because market volatility feels way different once your financial life becomes dependent on withdrawals rather than contributions. In other words, your W-2 income, your 1099 income, your independent contractor income, whatever that may be, has now gone away. Now we're trying to live off of what we've been able to save all these years. And the question a lot of people have is like, did I save enough? And if I did, is it going to be stable? Like, what happens if the market takes a tank? And that's the questions, that's the kind of narrative that was going on in the mind of my client, which is what led us to have the conversations that we were having, again, just a few short weeks ago. So let's keep going. During accumulation years, volatility can feel often very abstract, right? Because it doesn't really have a direct impact on your life. But during retirement, volatility becomes very emotional, right? It can affect your confidence. It can affect your spending behavior. It can affect flexibility. It can affect generosity, the peace of mind that you have, how you show up for your family, how you show up at church, right? What trips you're actually able to go take. How intentional are you going to be within the life that you live on a day-to-day basis, right? That's what matters a whole lot. Becomes a lot more of an emotional decision than simply just like, do I have enough money saved up? Okay, I hope that makes sense. And so everything that I'm saying here, this distinction mattered a lot to him. The more we talked, the more he realized he did not necessarily want all of his future retirement confidence tied exclusively to volatile assets. He wanted part of his financial life positioned somewhere that's way more stable, way more predictable, a lot less emotionally reactive to market swings. Again, he doesn't see this as like a replacement for investing, but he sees it as a way to counterbalance some of the things that he has no control over, which is how the market goes up and down and up and down. And frankly, I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions that people have with strategies about high cash value life insurance, specifically when we're talking about high cash value whole life insurance. Many people assume that the conversation is about replacing your stock market assets. And by no stretch of the imagination would I ever recommend that, right? I'm not gonna say I'll never will, but it's one of those things to where more times than not, I probably will not, simply because most of the people's goals that in terms of people that I'm talking to, they are okay having some level of risk exposure. But if they want to take all of the risk off whatsoever or minimize it to the lowest degree, maybe will consider that. But that's not some of the blanket advice that I would give to anybody, for lack of a better way of saying that, okay? Anyways, in reality, for many thoughtful investors and professionals, the conversation is often about reducing dependency. Dependency on what? Dependency on things that they cannot control. Like, I know I'm kind of pounding the drum and I'm saying that over and over again, but the stock market is not something that you can control. You can have the control to trade your stocks or have a higher or lesser aggression, if you want to say that, in terms of the market, but you do not have control over what actually happens within the market in and of itself. And so that's a completely different mindset. And initially, we explored a policy structure that allowed for contributions approaching $80,000. Remember, he makes $400,000 a year. His day-to-day expenses are more than set and taken care of. And so when we looked at that mathematically, of course, the larger design certainly created more long-term accumulation potential, right? Especially because additional PUAs, or paid up additions as we call them in the whole life insurance world, generally improve long-term efficiency, which is great. That's what we want. But interestingly, after several conversations, he actually became more comfortable with contributing a lot more aggressively, not to the tune of like contributing more, but we had a fuller conversation about the base versus the PUA, the minimum required premium versus the optional premium that you can put into the policy to maximize cash value growth. We had a more specific conversation about that. And he understood the value of maximizing additional contributions over time and fully intended to fund the policy very meaningfully over time as well. But eventually the conversation shifted from theoretical maximums to more so realistic behavior. And as we refined the strategy further, he realized that although he liked having flexibility, he realistically planned on contributing about $40,000 per year on a very, very consistent basis. And once we framed it that way, the question became, if I'm realistically going to fund about $40,000 per year anyway, does it really make sense to structure the policy around a contribution ceiling that I won't regularly take advantage of, right? In other words, if I'm contributing $40,000 per year and I have the option to go up to $60,000 or $80,000, like that's great if someone wants to do that every so often. But if the reality is that he's not going to contribute up to $60,000 or $80,000 in any given year for the most part, we want to maximize as much PUA as we can and lower the minimum premium, lower that base as low as we can so that he has significantly more cash value early on and in the long run. Okay. And if you're not fully sure what I mean when I say base premiums or paid up additions or PUAs or minimum premiums and maximum premiums, all that sort of stuff, if you're not exactly sure what I mean by that, I actually created an ebook that's free to you. So you can go ahead and go to the description, download that, and it'll tell you everything that you need to know about overfunded whole life insurance. So anyways, for my client, this distinction really mattered because designing a policy around unrealistic contribution levels may create larger theoretical upside, but it may also reduce efficiency and increase unnecessary premium requirements along the way. So ultimately, what gave him confidence wasn't scaling the structure to the absolute maximum possible. It was building something intentional, efficient, and that was aligned with how he actually planned to save into an asset like this over time. And I think there's a much bigger lesson here. Financial confidence is not always about the mathematical maximization per se. Sometimes it's more about alignment, specifically alignment between your goals, behavior, flexibility, the lifestyle you have today and in the future, and emotional sustainability. And so what stood out to me throughout this entire process was that he wasn't trying to abandon investing altogether by any stretch of the imagination. He still planned on aggressively contributing to traditional retirement accounts and continuing to build wealth in that way. He simply no longer wanted virtually all of his future confidence tied to market-based assets alone. Ultimately, we landed on the structure that felt balanced to him. He continued maximizing traditional retirement vehicles while intentionally building a separate pool of stable capital designed to create additional flexibility, liquidity, and predictability later in life. And that's the distinction that mattered here, because the goal was never to eliminate growth or hinder any of the growth that he was having, but the goal was to reduce concentration within one asset class, and he wanted to create a level of balance within the overall portfolio. And I think that's one of the biggest themes that I personally keep noticing in conversations with very thoughtful professionals that are approaching retirement, is that over time, many people become less and less obsessed with maximizing optimization and maximizing returns, and they become more focused on creating stability, optionality, flexibility, and confidence. Not because they've become financially conservative, but because they've become financially experienced. And often that experience changes the questions people begin asking about money. And if you're seeking more stability and predictability within your financial life and in the future cash flow plan that you're looking to create for yourself, go ahead and type the word stable in the comments, because I know you're not alone. And if there's anything that I can do to help, go ahead and let me know as well. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.